Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll just give another minute or so for people to join. My name is Jessica. I'm from the Chelmsford Library, and I really appreciate you coming in tonight. Hi, Gail. Thanks for joining us. All right, so while we're waiting for people to come into the room, I'm just going to share a few upcoming programs through the Chelmsford Library. All of the ones that I'm going to mention here are virtual, or I'll mention otherwise. The first one is next Thursday, March 24th. We have a program with Mass Audubon on the nature of spring. So that's about the wildlife, flora and fauna, and in springtime in Massachusetts. Oh, hi, Kitty. The next one is, actually, this one's a hybrid. You can join virtually or you can attend, but because we're talking about food tonight, I just wanted to give a plug for our Bibliobites reading group. It's a Bibliobites book group. It's a cookbook book group. So they take a book home, try out some recipes, come back and talk about how they found the book and how they found the food. The next one is a living history presentation on Bessie Coleman, the first African-American woman and first Native American licensed aviator. And that's going to be a person performing as Bessie Coleman and also talking about her life and experience in history. And the next one is our monthly Art on Tuesdays on Georgia O'Keeffe called Beyond the Blossoms. That's going to be on Tuesday, March 29th. And finally, we have a presentation on the films, life, and work of Sidney Poitier, and that's going to be on Thursday, March 31st. But tonight we have a very timely program, and I'm so glad that we have such a good crowd here tonight. Sarah Lohman, who will be presenting tonight, is the author of 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine. Released in 2016 with Simon & Schuster, 8 Flavors is a #1 bestseller on Amazon. The Atlantic called the book richly researched, intriguing, and cleverly written, and you can borrow it from the library. Her current book project, Endangered Eating, Exploring America's Vanishing Culture, will be released by W.W. Norton & Co. in January 2023, and she is based in Las Vegas, Nevada. Formerly the curator of food programming at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, she has lectured at hundreds of universities and institutions nationwide, including the Museum of Science Boston and the American Museum of Natural History and the New York Public Library. So we're very fortunate to be able to have her online with us tonight. You can learn more about her at sarahlohman.com. That's SARAHLOHMAN.com. Tonight, we're going to talk about Irish food, a history that I don't think I know very much about, so this is great. This program will cover the surprisingly complicated and heartbreaking backstory of Irish food from dinner in the homeland to the diets of Irish American immigrants. And so happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. I was just saying, I love this talk so much. And of course, I only get to give it about once a year. So let's get into it. So I should have called this a brief history of Irish food beyond potatoes, but also including potatoes, because obviously that is one of the main foods that we associate with Irish people. And of course, I already saw in the chat that some of you had some corned beef and cabbage tonight. We'll end with an explanation of that dish as well. But we can really break Irish cuisine into 3 periods. Excuse me, let me find my words. Let me get a tiny bit of caffeine in me. I'm on the West Coast, so it's still early enough. There's a lot of cats that need attention right now, so they'll be popping into the screen, I'm sure. So we have pre-colonization, we have post-British colonization, and then we have post-immigration to America. Those are sort of the 3 distinct eras of Irish food, and we're going to give each one of them a little bit of time. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat at any time. I'll be taking some little breaks throughout to break this up a little bit, and I'm going to get some help doing some Q&A. So if you think of something, put it in the chat. We'll answer it in the middle. We'll answer it at the end. I'm always happy to answer questions. So Here's a typical Irish kitchen of probably the past couple hundred years. It's rare to find one still living in a home that looks like this, but certainly these spaces still exist as historical homes. Irish kitchens looked like this probably until really the mid 20th century. They are really, really typically simple, and we'll get into some of the reasons why and some of the benefits of that. So more often than not, there was a packed dirt floor. The walls could be mud. This one actually looks like it's brick too. It usually started as one room and then might be built off from there. This one has a proper hearth and fireplace, although other simpler homes would just have a fire pit in the middle of the room. This one also has a proper chimney, but it was actually more common just to let the smoke go up through the thatch roof. Also, if someone's preserving meat, that's a good place to put your meat up there to get smoked. Otherwise, it would just go through the thatch. This is really beneficial because there is not a lot to clean. There was rarely even enough furniture for everyone to sit down at once. Meals were, for the most part, again, through the early 20th century, one-pot meals. You can see in terms of cooking equipment, all we've got are 2 pots. One even might be like a tea kettle, and that's it. So, I mean, that is typical of historical food. Recipes get more complicated, the more complicated our cooking utensils get. So when we were doing hearth and open fire cooking, a lot of one-pot meals for the majority of the population. And then from historical records, people would often eat together in the morning and the evening. Kids would sit on the floor. People would sit on little stools called creepies and would sit around the center pot and all eat together. Now, the other advantage of a simple kitchen with a one-pot meal is you're not spending a lot of time cooking and preparing food. So in historical Irish culture, and we can see echoes of this today too, there was quite a bit of equality between men's and women's work and quite a bit of freedom for women even after they were married, which is unusual historically, because they weren't devoting as much time to labor inside the home. People had more time and weren't devoting as much time to really fancy foods. People had a lot more time to socialize, do their own thing, do nothing if they wanted to. And I think that a really interesting kind of symbolic gesture of the idea of women being an independent entity is that, and if you're Irish, you might know this, within Irish culture, it's quite common to call even married women by their maiden name. So if you've got sort of a last name relationship, or even when someone's addressed by their full name, they're usually addressed by their maiden name, not by their married last name, which I think is really fascinating. So someone might look at this kitchen and say, "Ugh, dirty, poor, empty." But for Irish families, it was just simple, so that you could spend less time cleaning and cooking and doing other fun and fulfilling things. Here's another example. Again, I hate to call it a wealthy home, but this is definitely a little bit more upper class in that there's, things that you don't necessarily need, but you still just have your big pot. You've got your kettle for tea. You've got beds. There's some doors, so there might be other bedrooms here. You can see an array of stools. And this one doesn't have a compressed dirt floor. It's got a wood floor, which takes a little bit more cleaning. So let's talk pre-colonization, because the Irish were conquered and colonized by the British, and that ultimately led to some of the most difficult times within Irish culture. So colonization happened over a period of about 100 years of pretty brutal battles from during the 16th, end of the 16th, end of the 17th centuries, okay? So by 1690, it was done, and there was an English Protestant ruling class. So before that time period, the Irish were some of the most well-fed, healthy, strapping, big people on the planet. They had a really diverse and healthy diet. And a lot of their food centered around the family cow. Now, beef was not eaten very commonly in Ireland, which, again, it seems interesting that we now eat corned beef to celebrate the Irish. We'll get to that. But this is true in cultures all over the world too. It's true in Italy. It's true in a lot of Southeast Asian cultures. The cow is more valuable for its milk and what you can get from the milk than it is for its meat. So usually you would have a cow that you would breed, so that it could be milked. And then you have cheese, you have butter, and you have milk and buttermilk as well. So these were kind of referred to as white meats historically, and they were really the protein staple center of a pre-colonial Irish diet. And this is an Irish manuscript from, I believe, the 14th century, and it is written in what today we call Gaelic, but historically was just called Irish. And there is almost this sort of cows weren't directly part of Irish Catholicism, but there is the sacred quality to the cow in like say late medieval Irish culture. The other animal that many households had was a pig, and this is something that lasts to a certain extent through the 19th century and then even into migration to America. Again, you've just got the one pig, you buy it, you feed it for a couple years. Pigs don't ask for much. You usually throw them your kitchen scraps and they get nice and fat. And then you walk that pig to the butcher and the butcher buys the pig. If you are a landowner, great, that's money you can use for whatever you want. Later on, if you were renting land from a landowner, you would use your pig to pay the rent. And that carried over to America as well when people were keeping pigs in their first floor tenement apartments or small houses in New York City, Boston, and other cities. You sell the pig, your pig pays the rent for the year. Although usually the pig was sold early on, and even through the 19th century, we do see bacon being a part of Irish culture. So the sort of preserved, salty, maybe less desirable cuts of meat might be bought back by the person who owned the pig. And then, of course, we have potatoes. So this is less of a part of the pre-colonial diet. These get introduced post-colonization. So I should say other parts of the pre-colonial diet. So we have the high protein dairy. We have a little bit of pork. If you live near the ocean, you were eating fresh fish and seaweed. If you lived away from the ocean, you were eating salt fish. And then you'd also have a garden full of vegetables. The ones that sort of carry on to later are definitely cabbages and onions, but you'd also have things like turnips and rutabagas and all the kinds of leafy greens. And then in pre-colonial Ireland, you also had crops of grains too. There was a fairly large sort of, I don't want to call it, let's say it's celebratory, a calendar of foodways linked to different Catholic holidays, different sweet breads and yes, potato dishes later on, but there was a pretty big diversity in Irish cuisine early. So you can see this is a really healthy diet. It's pretty meat-free, lots of vegetables, lots of dairy, and maybe a little bit of pork or fish in there. So when colonialism comes along, it basically introduces an English Protestant or Scotch Irish, as it's later known, ruling class that owns most of the land. And then that land is rented out to tenant farmers. The tenant farmers work the land and then basically sell usually the grain that they're growing back to the landlord to pay their rent, okay? So to provide for themselves, the tenant farmers have to plant their own food. And they're often living on fairly small plots of land. This happens in part because for those Irish that did own land before colonization, one of the British rules commanded that land be split between all of the family's sons instead of just the firstborn son. Usually the firstborn son got the land, became the farmer, the other children would take up a trade. But under the new colonial rule, the land had to be divided and subdivided until it got to a point where one plot of land couldn't produce enough food for a family. This is another way that landowners then bought up land and created the system of tenant farmers. So what can you grow on a really small piece of land that might also not be very fertile soil? Potatoes. Potatoes come from the Andes. They're used to rocky and depleted soil. They can really just grow, produce lots of food. They can even sit in the field all winter and be dug up fresh when you need them. So they're from the Americas. They're introduced in the Columbian Exchange by the 16th century, and they're introduced into Ireland by the 17th century. And they become very quickly the staple food source for Irish people as this larger diversity of food that depended on farmable land is taken away from them. One Irish person a day, a laboring, young, strapping man, that's the second time I've used the word strapping, but a big guy doing a lot of work might eat between 10 and 30 pounds of potatoes in a day. Again, that's because that's the only food that you have. If you're lucky, you might have a little bit of what was called kitchening. Kitchening would be like salt fish or salted dried seaweed, or it might be a little bit of buttermilk. If you're lucky enough to still have a cow, at this point, you don't get to keep the milk to make your own butter and cheese. You make butter and cheese and then you sell it and you're left over with the buttermilk or the whey. And so these things might go into the potatoes. But if you've got nothing else, you boil potatoes in that pot. They get thrown directly on a table or onto the floor, maybe dipped into some salt and eaten with your bare hands. Most people will pull the skins off and just eat your potatoes just like that. In the cities, though, there was still a diversity of crops being produced and in the country and sold in the cities, but for the most part, these were being consumed by the landed gentry. Those would be the English Protestants. So you can see a lot of potatoes in the foreground too, but you can also see a variety of greens and other foods in this image of what's an early 20th century market. But interestingly, this food was just completely out of the reach of most rural Irish people. And a lot of the food that was being produced on Irish lands was being exported to England, and then England might export it beyond and sell it too. So this was sort of this tenant-farmer relationship, this colonized relationship where the food that was being grown was being, for the most part, sent out of Ireland. And then the blight hits. So before we get to the blight, I actually see we've got, a couple questions coming up. I got the Q&A. Let me know if there's anything in the chat. So it says, why does Massachusetts have a brown corned beef versus the traditional red corned beef for a corned beef dinner? We're jumping a little bit ahead, but I can't answer that. Most corned beef today is dyed red. If you buy a package, like make your own corned beef, it comes with red fruit coloring, which is very weird. The red coloring comes from the salting process. Traditional corned beef is cured in salt before you boil it. So if you've got a brown corned beef, that is interesting. That just seems like a pot roast to me, because the salt actually changes the color of the meat and makes this bright red meat when it's cooking, unless it's dyed. But I wasn't aware that Massachusetts also had the brown corned beef too. Interesting. Other questions out there too?
Yeah, one more. Why did they only get one pig instead of raising two and keeping one?
Money. It was just simpler. Like, it just wasn't thought of it that way. You've got enough resources to raise one pig, you sell the pig, and you get enough money back to pay your rent for a year. So why would you need more than one pig? It's not necessarily, I think that's a very, very smart question, but also something that, like, I don't want to say just didn't occur to them, was deemed unnecessary. You might get a little bacon back, but like, you don't need two pigs. You just need one pig.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. That's all the questions we had. We thought, someone also thought 10 to 30 pounds of potatoes is quite a lot of potatoes.
A lot of potatoes. I have to admit, I am tempted to try that sometime. I often, as a culinary historian, like to sort of live out these ways of doing things to see what it's like. And it seems like a lot of potatoes, but we mostly eat potatoes as a side, right? So if the only thing you're eating in a day is potatoes, and then you're working as a farm laborer, does that balance out? I guess I would like to see how many pounds of potatoes I can eat in a day. I'll keep you updated. Maybe we'll do something next St. Patrick's Day and we'll see.
Thank you.
So in 1845, the Great Famine hits. It's a potato blight. This blight is a fungus-like microorganism that, if you've ever cut open a potato and seen like this inside, that is the blight that caused the Great Famine, or the Great Hunger, as it was known in Ireland. It's still around. We just have better fungicides that prevent its growth. Okay, well, we have fungicides, period, that prevent its growth. We didn't have anything to stop it historically. Now, we really associate potatoes with Ireland, but potatoes were eaten by poorer classes all throughout Europe. And the famine did have effects on people all over Europe. We talk about it, we historians talk about pushing a great migration out of Ireland, but it was also the beginning of the migration of Eastern European and Russian Jews as well, who were often also dependent on potatoes. But no culture was as connected to potatoes as the Irish. It wasn't a food that was celebrated as the cornerstone of their cuisine. Because it was forced on them by the English, it was really resented. So it was eaten with a little bit of resentment, but out of necessity, because it is a very calorically dense and nutrient-rich food. You can live on a diet of 30 pounds of potatoes or whatever with maybe a little bit of kitchening. But now this is the only crop that people are growing outside of maybe a little patch of cabbage and onions. And now this crop is being decimated. So when blight hits, it spreads very quickly through a field. There's no saving the potatoes. By the time you notice that the first one is going, the rest of them probably already have it. And it really just like melts the potatoes in the field. Was very little edible food to recover from an infected potato patch. So this hits in 1845 after really at least 100 years of this colonial tenant farmer environment with land being divided smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the people who are dependent on this food source are often the poorest people in Ireland. And I mean, there's no other way to say it. There's a massive die-off. Between 1845 and 1851, 1 million people die in Ireland. These are largely the young, the old, and the sick. And it's not necessarily from starvation. More commonly, it's from starvation-related illnesses, things like cholera, honestly. You're eating food that's not as good for you. You are starving, so you're more open to disease. Your immune system isn't as good as it should be. So people are dying of illnesses, but are illnesses that are from the result of starvation. Within the next 10 to 15 years, the amount of people who have died has doubled. About 2 million die in this first famine that hits in 1845, and then another 2 million emigrate or leave Ireland. About 1.5 million people come to America, largely to New York and Boston, but of course not exclusively. Boston has the largest percentage of Irish population by the 1860s versus the rest of the city. New York has more Irish people than any other American city by the 1860s. New York City is about 25% Irish. And you know what, I don't remember the 1860s number, but like they were the majority group in Boston at that time. So emigration becomes not an anomaly, but a fact of life. Often it's daughters who were sent to the New World, and not necessarily the oldest daughter. I'm curious if anyone has stories about who came to this country within your own families. You don't send the oldest, you send the loudest one. You send the most stubborn one. You send the one that you think can make her way alone. Because for the most part, these are not whole families that are emigrating. It's just sending girls alone. And that's because there is work for women in America. Irish women who emigrated to America tended to work as servants in middle class on up households. So there was a desperate in that people expected it, need for domestic labor in America at this time. And while the earlier wave of German immigrants filled in some of these spaces, it would largely be Irish immigrants and young women who would come work in these households. As a young Irish woman, you would work in this household basically until you got married, at which point you tended to leave service to take care of your own home. So this is an image of the Merchants House Museum, which is in the East Village of Manhattan. It is an extremely well preserved, and most of the furniture is original 1830s house. And this is the type of home that young Irish women would be sent to work in. Part of this deal is that you were paid a salary, but you also got room and board. You tended to be living in these houses and also fed. So that made the immigration process very, very, very easy. And since you had most of what you needed day to day, you can send quite a bit of money home. Additionally, as a young woman, basically a teenager, you could spend money on yourself too. So Irish domestics were known as being incredibly fashionably dressed. And in the 19th century, most home employees weren't uniformed, so they would often dress as well as the women who employed them. And there were also church dances on Wednesdays and Sunday nights where you would often meet a potential husband. So looking at a space like this, like think back to those Irish rooms I first showed you, those very, very simple kitchens, the pressed dirt floors, the minimal of furniture. And then imagine maybe being a 14-year-old girl thrust into this space and you're expected now to care for this household. There's a quote from a woman named Sarah Hale, who was a very famous food and fashion and house writer from the 19th century. And she said, "The great fault of the Irish help is that they undertake to do what they have never learned." And in a way, that is a little bit more thoughtful than what most Americans were saying about the Irish in the 19th century. The fact is, women here were coming here totally untrained and had no idea how to operate in a kitchen like this. This is a kitchen from the same space, the Merchant's House Museum. You know, when we were talking a fire pit and one pot in the middle of the floor, look at how incredibly fancy this coal burning oven is. There is a bread oven here as well. There was running water in this home by the 1830s too. So there is a very, very steep learning curve for Irish help. Now, most Americans portray the Irish as ignorant or even stupid for not knowing what to do in these households, uncivilized or uncultured as well. But really, it was just a process of coming into an entirely different culture. Let me give you an example of what, so if you were kind of middle class, you'd have one servant called a maid of all work. In a bigger house like this, there would at least be like a cook, a lady's maid, a butler. There would be a couple different servants. This woman, wait, actually, let's come back to that. This woman right here, her name is Hannah Colwick. She was actually a servant in Britain, but she kept a very detailed journal that gives us a glimpse into what one day of life for a maid of all work would be. She's also showing off her muscles in this picture because you had to be an extremely strong and fit woman to be doing all the physical labor of a maid of all work. So here's one entry from her diary. Opened the shutters and lighted the kitchen fire. Shook my sooty thing in the dust hole and emptied the soot there. Swept and dusted the rooms and hall, laid the hearth and got breakfast up, cleaned 2 pairs of boots, made the beds and emptied the slaps, cleaned and washed the breakfast things up, cleaned the plate, cleaned the knives and got dinner up, cleaned away, cleaned the kitchen up, unpacked a hamper, took 2 chickens to Mrs. Brewer's and brought the message back, made a tart and picked and gutted 2 ducks and roasted them, cleaned the steps and flags on my knees, blackheaded the scraper in front of the house, cleaned the street flags, 2 on my knees, washed up in the scullery, cleaned the pantry on my knees and scoured the tables, scrubbed the flags around the house and cleaned the windowsills, got tea for the master and Mrs. Warwick, cleaned the privy and passage and scullery floor on my knees, washed the dog and cleaned the sinks down, put the supper ready for Anne to take up, for I was too dirty and tired to go upstairs, washed in a bath and went to bed. So there's your typical day as an Irish woman if you're helping in even a middle-class household. Now that we have Irish women in the kitchens, we do have Irish cuisine sort of seeping into the broader culinary atmosphere of America. This is a recipe from a manuscript in New York City from the 1840s, and it's called Bridget's Loaf Cake. And this is the first Irish recipe to make it into an American cookbook. This was actually copied out of this book here, which I actually believe is Catherine Beecher's cookbook. Catherine Beecher is the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it's interesting that I then found this in a manuscript because it shows that this is a recipe that people were actually making in their homes. It's essentially Irish soda bread, but it comes from a time, actually it is. It comes from a time where we're not using a lot of chemical leaveners. This is it uses dough as well, that means like leftover bread dough, essentially, something with yeast. But it also uses pearl ash, which is the earliest form of chemical leavening. Pearl ash is a little bit like baking soda, and it was really only used in America. It's not an ingredient that was used in Ireland or in Britain. So the idea of Irish soda bread, like many parts about St. Patrick's Day, is an American contribution. St. Patrick's Day is truly an Irish American holiday. So this is when we start seeing things like Irish soda bread, like coal cannon, which is a mixture of potatoes and cabbage. We see things like boxty, which is a dish that's sort of made from potatoes that are going bad a little bit too. So we start to see Irish food appear in American kitchens, and also Irish women are learning how to cook quote unquote American food, which can mean a variety of things. If they're cooking in a German household, it's German food. If they're cooking in a Jewish household, it's kosher cuisine from wherever part of the world they're from. If they're in an Old English household, it might be British food. It might also be French food, which is very popular at this time. Not only were Irish help was portrayed as being stupid. There's a lot of comics. This is a stereoscope, which is like a 3D picture from the time. The joke is how Biddy comes from Bridget, a very common Irish name. So you've got patties and biddies. How Biddy served tomatoes undressed. Indeed, ma'am, and I'll not take off another stitch if I lose me place. Of course, that means plain tomatoes without any dressing on them, but she's dumb or ignorant, so she thinks it means naked. But it's also interesting that Irish women are also portrayed as being very sassy and powerful. And again, remember, we didn't send our oldest daughters, we sent our loudest daughters. And so historians now believe that there is some truth to that the generations of Irish people that came here were the loud and independent ones. So the sort of stereotype of like the Irish fire and stubbornness, there might be a little bit of truth to that. Here's another cartoon that depicts some of that. You can see too, physically how Irish women were portrayed versus the delicate, dainty American woman. It says, Bridget, you've broken as much china this month as your wages amount to. Now, how can we prevent this from occurring again? Bridget answers, oh, I don't know, Mom, unless you's raised me wages. Pretty funny, pretty sassy, into it. You also notice that even though she's being portrayed as a little gruff and even ape-like, she's dressed really beautifully. So at least they give her that she looks quite fashionable in her dress, although not quite as fashionable as her very, very dainty lady. And a Cowick. So I'm going to pause again. What we're going to talk about next is what happens after these young women get married and move out of their households. And that'll bring us to the neighborhood of 5 points. So, we've got a story here. So oldest 2 daughters of my family, the ones that immigrated from County Mayo, Ireland to Clinton, Massachusetts. That's from Diane. Diane, were they sassy women? Is your family sassy and stubborn? Other questions out there?
Yeah, going back to the blighted potato, what happens if you eat a blighted potato? And does the blight stay in the soil and infect the field next year?
Yeah, so the way that I've heard it portrayed is it's a fungus-like microorganism. And so it is a blight that stays in the soil and will affect the crop next year. And again, to prevent this today, we spray the plants with fungicides to help keep it at bay. The blighted potato, Dan says no, but they were hardworking. Not sassy, but hardworking. I mean, you had to be. Being a domestic was no joke. A blighted tomato isn't going to hurt you, but it's also not a food. It's a squishy, gross kind of, I mean, I say inedible, but I'm sure people tried, but it's just basically a liquefied potato when it gets really bad. Yeah, gross, right?
And Virginia had a memory. Schrafts would bring the Irish women to work in their restaurants, even as youngsters.
Mm-hmm. So Schrafts was a early to mid 20th century dining establishment, and it was one of the ones that sorry, I keep looking at my window too because there's somebody's lost dog outside. I'm going to get it in a minute. It seems fat and happy and content. So they were essentially a diner. So yeah, Irish immigration really kept up through the 1920s and 30s. I mean, I know in New York City to this day, I talk about New York a lot. I lived there for 13 years. My brother lives up in Boston, but there is still an Irish immigrant neighborhood in New York. And actually Irish immigrants make up a pretty large portion of undocumented immigrants in today. About 40% of all undocumented immigrants are Caucasian, and they're largely coming from Eastern Europe and Ireland. So there is still in a immigration to this day. The Irish economy still falls upon tough times. Dana mentioned that her family worked in textile mills. I'm sure that a number of you were, wait, the name just fell out of my head, but about when you can tell me the town outside of Boston that was a famous textile area. Lowell. I bet you definitely had family members that were Lowell girls. Lowell employed basically farm girls in the middle of the 19th century. Like anyone could go and be a local for a couple of years, have some independence and go home and get married. And then at the turn of the 20th century, that's when it became predominantly immigrant labor. Other questions?
Yeah, sorry.
No, you're doing great.
Alana was asking, was it unusual for the maid to be literate? You had read.
No, it was not unusual for the maid to be literate because there were English schools. So the Irish population was actually a very well-educated population when they were immigrating here. So again, young Irish women, and by the way, more Irish women came than Irish men, especially early on. They were literate and educated. They were financially independent because they had room and board and money of their own. And women often married younger men because they were much more financially powerful. So these were really sort of fierce and independent women, especially the ones who were coming in the mid 19th century.
Great. So that's all the questions we have for now.
All right, let's talk about 5 Points. So again, I'm sure that there is probably a similar neighborhood in Boston. You have to pardon my ignorance of full Boston history. But 5 Points is pretty notorious. You've probably heard of it, especially if you've seen the movie Gangs of New York. So when you are a young married couple, a woman who's been in service might get married anytime from her early 20s to her late 20s, even her early 30s. And some women didn't get married at all. They stayed in service. This was basically the most affordable neighborhood to live in. It was filled with older housing, like turn of the 19th century housing, wood housing that was sinking into a filled-in lake. It was a really diverse neighborhood. You can even see, looking at this image, that there are white and Black people living in this neighborhood together. It's very common in America for someone who is African American to also have Irish heritage, because in the mid-19th century, there was a lot of intermarriage. There was also a lot of competition and hate and racism between these two groups as well. It was basically two extremes. You can see in this picture, there is a public water pump. There are people selling food. There are pigs running around, our old friends, the piggies. Again, that tradition of having a household pig carried on to America, especially if you lived on the first floor. Your pig lived with you. You opened the door. The pig roamed around the streets and ate garbage during the day and came home at night. They're smart. They're smart as a cat or a dog. And then you sold the pig to the butcher and paid your rent for another year. Also notice too, how many buildings mention whiskey, liquor, alcohol. Grocery stores tended to have bars in the back for women. A survey done of 5 Points in the mid-19th century showed that about 70% of all Irish businesses made or sold alcohol. And of Irish landowners, people who actually owned their property, didn't rent, almost 100% of Irish landowners in America made or sold alcohol. So at this time, the Irish relationship with food is really broken. They were forced to eat for about 100 years of food that they hated because it represented their oppressors. And then that food crop failed. And so when they came to America, unlike other immigrant groups that came from places who were economically destitute or for facing famine, they didn't celebrate their food. Like if you think about Italian Americans and Chinese Americans and the complexity and diversity of cuisines that they created here in this country, that didn't happen with Irish Americans. They mostly ate more of the food they were familiar with at home. More potatoes, if you can imagine, cabbage, carrots, onions, bread. They just bought more of that stuff. And it was more as an idea of not like a luxury or joy, but just the success was not being hungry anymore. And if you were serving meat on your table, it was more to show off that you had made it, that you had American money now, not for the joy of eating meat. So that's the best way historians can describe it, that their relationship with food was so broken, they didn't go back to pre-colonial ways of eating. They didn't try to mimic the upper classes, which is what Italian and Chinese immigrants did. They just bought more potatoes. Most Irish culture revolved around drink. Alcohol. And we can see that in the celebration of St. Patrick's Day today, that people tend to go out drinking because they were seen as communal spaces. Women drank in the home mostly, and they could drink at celebrations like weddings and birthdays and funerals. Men drank in bars. Those were men-only spaces that were also connected to getting hired for work. People would hire day laborers out of the bars. Politics would meet there too. That's where you cast your ballot. Women couldn't vote at this time, so it wasn't necessary to make the ballot available in a place that women could access. And also that's where union meetings and mutual aid societies would meet in bars too. So for both men and then the bars in the back of grocery stores were largely for women as well. So these were center points of culture for Irish Americans, both men and women. Speaking of drinking, this is McSorley's, which is also in the East Village of Manhattan. I'm curious if you have, this bar was founded in 1854. I wonder if you can beat me here, Boston. Do you have any older Irish bars? And this bar is really amazing. The next time you're in the city, please get out there because it's changed very little since 1854. It's been added onto, but you can see all the layers of the old bar beneath it. One thing that's an addition, okay, you might notice, first of all, there's no stools at the bar. Stools at a bar is a very 20th century thing. There is a rail to lean on, but that's a late 19th century thing. So early on, this wouldn't be there. It's just the bar, okay? Again, men-only establishment. McSorley's actually doesn't serve whiskey. They serve light and dark beer in true pints. So they actually give you two when you order one because it's an actual pint of alcohol, not the big like steins that we're used to. Another selling point was the heat. This is a pot-bellied stove that they still light up coal in, and you kick your feet up there to get warm. Also hot water on top too. And they serve a pretty basic meal that would have been part of the free lunch table in the saloon historically. Like they have like saltine crackers, mustard, cheese, and onion slices. That's like pretty much what you can buy for food in McSorley's. Dust on the floor. Descriptions of these bars, 19th century, talk about that there's like framed nudes and boxing champions on the walls. Like this is a bar straight out of the 19th century, and you definitely get that experience when you walk into this space. Now, speaking more of the depictions of Irish men and women too, this is a Thomas Nast drawing of a St. Patrick's Day, I believe in the 1870s. And when you look at the Irish men, you can see again, they're portrayed with these ape-like qualities. They're violent, they're brutal. The poor police are being stepped upon, and they call this an Irish riot. So this is how Americans saw St. Patrick's Day. But for the Irish, St. Patrick's Day was a celebration of their Irishness, a preserving of their culture, and a coming together within this new country. And actually, I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. We'll come back to these things because I want to show you this image. While 5 Points was associated with Irish culture, over the years that Irish people came here, became established, they moved up the economic ladder. Most Irish people became middle class by the late 19th century. This is another depiction from the same era, from the 1870s, of St. Patrick's Day. And you can see that this Irish depiction looks quite different. We have this very middle-class family. They're waving their hankies at the procession going by. The St. Patrick's Day parade in New York City is the oldest in the country. It was founded in the 1760s. So it's a very, very, very old parade. And you can see just through their balcony here on the other side, there is the saloon. So though even for this middle-class family and having this very refined celebration, alcohol is still central to the Irish culture and Irish way of life. So this is what Fine Points and sort of rear tenements, or basically center of the block buildings, look like. And this is where a lot of Irish people live when they're first starting out. But once you got more established, you're going to move into a space like this. This is sort of between this and that upper middle class home that I showed you. This is actually a photograph of the apartment of an Irish family that has been recreated at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in Manhattan. You can see in this kitchen that there's a lot more influence from the American mistress that that the wife and mother of this family would have worked for than there is her Irish kitchen back home. This was a way that they often Americanized by decorating, by cooking quote unquote American foods. But you can see on the table too, there's some potatoes, there's some bread, there's some onions, and that's about all there is. Through the room there's a formal parlor with chinaware, pictures, chairs, bottles of whiskey. This is a 3-room apartment, 325 square feet. And for those of you who live outside of cities, you're probably shocked at how small that is. But for a New Yorker, this apartment to this day is luxurious, is absolutely luxurious. So if you also want to get a sense of how Irish people were living in the middle of the 19th century, I highly encourage a visit to the Tenement Museum. There we go, close up at the kitchen. We still got our kettle. We've got more pots and pans. The oven has gotten more complicated and the tools have gotten more complicated too. But at the same time, Irish food pretty much stayed the same. One of the big shifts though is the consumption of tea. Tea becomes a really inexpensive import in the middle of the 19th century, as does sugar in America. So Irish help and Irish wives and mothers, they basically lived on tea. It was like Popeye's spinach for young Irish women. Tea, milk, and sugar was a meal substitute and sort of a mood and energy booster for Irish women. And the Irish, of course, you know, there are many aspects of Irish culture that are celebrated, even though food is not one of them. We all know about Irish writers, poets, and musicians as well. And although they don't talk about food as much as they do drinking, there are definitely some Irish songs about food out there. One of them is from a musical that was written in New York in the 1870s called The McSorleys, which was sort of based around life in that bar, which is still open to this day, which is crazy. And they have there's a song within this musical called The Market on Saturday Night. This is from a illustration from a card promoting this musical, and it gives you a glimpse into what city markets look like at this point and the diversity of food that was available in port cities like New York or Boston. You can see watermelons, you can see game, you can see chickens and hams and more chickens and dry foods. Oh, and there's even a streetcar going past in the background. That's pretty cool. There's a fight breaking out. There's eggs on the ground. There's a lot going on here. And invaluable to any historian is this actual song, which describes all the foods that can be found in the market on a Saturday night, meaning Sunday's the day where you're going to have a big meal after church. In the 1870s. Let me give you one verse of the chorus. I'm not going to sing it though. We sell turnips and partridges, turkeys and cabbages, crockery and tinware so bright. It's parsnips and cresses and little babes' dresses at the market on Saturday night. An incredible song. Celery so crispy and white, pickles and chow chow, and dogs that say bow wow. It's a great rhyme scheme too, and it really paints a picture as well. We also had music that was used as warnings, because even in middle class neighborhoods, there was a lot of food insecurity in cities, again, like New York, Boston, Chicago, because for the first time ever, most people weren't producing their own food as America urbanized. And in a place like New York and Boston, food was coming from further and further and further away. So this is a song that is a warning about swill milk, which is watered down, adulterated, and spoiled milk that could be obviously very harmful for children and families. So one of the biggest ways that Irish food did change in America is that they did consume more meat. And now we have this really like, not just typical, but like the Irish dish in America is corned beef and cabbage. So what is the deal? So as Irish immigrants came to this country, they were living in or next to neighborhoods with other immigrants from other places. And when Irish people did buy meat, they almost exclusively bought it from their Jewish neighbors. So they were buying it from kosher butchers, and they were buying products like corned beef. So even though corned beef is something that is associated with, like, I mean, think of this as the same kind of thing you're going to buy in a Jewish deli, a big corned beef sandwich. So it was also an Eastern European preparation. It was produced in Ireland for export, at least through the 18th century. The idea comes from the name corned comes from the size of the grains of salt used to cure it. So it was rubbed with this really, really large grain salt, and corn in Britain is acorn. So like a grain, essentially. You'd have like a corn of wheat, okay? So it was saying that the salt crystals were as big as a grain. And so corned beef is beef that's rubbed with salt, cured for a number of time, and then sort of like cooked low and slow. So it gets all like pull apart and salty and nice. So when Irish people did buy meat, which wasn't that often, they'd buy it from their kosher butcher neighbor. And for some reason they'd buy corned beef, probably because they were familiar with it from back home, but since it was produced for export, didn't consume it themselves. This is the one way in which Irish American cultures reflects the normal trajectories of other cultures. For example, we have such incredible Italian American food because the Italians who came here were laborers who were, for the most part, producing those foods for other people back in Ireland. But then once they came to America and were making more money, they were producing those foods for other people back in Italy. But once they came to America and made more money, they would import all those foods they couldn't afford before to America and make Italian food. So we see a little bit of that happening here, but then just like traditional Irish cooking, you take the corned beef, you put it in a pot, you throw in some cabbage, you might throw in some potatoes, one pot meal, done and done and done, just like Irish women have been cooking it for the past couple hundred years. So that is history of Irish food. I see we've got a couple other questions. This is my book, by the way. Oh, thank you. I got a cheers. This is my book, by the way. I don't talk, I believe, about Irish food in there, but if you enjoyed this lecture, you will enjoy my book and all the food and flavors and cuisines and cultures of America that I talk about in that. Do we have any other questions in the chat?
Yeah, someone did have another question about the potato blight. I think their thought was that Ireland was exporting other food to England, and that was one of the reasons that there was still so much starvation.
Yeah, and that's okay. So I mentioned too that most Irish people in the colonial era were tenant farmers. They're producing food that was being exported, right? And definitely that reason is a huge part of how am I trying to phrase it? Yes, and that's exaggerated to a certain extent because Ireland was so mad at their colonizers. England did open up food resources, but it was a little bit, as I've heard it described, like too little too late. They offered soup kitchens, they offered food deliveries, but like there were many years of inaction, that 1,000 people died in the first 5 years. And yeah, all of that food being produced was being shipped out of Ireland. And that was sort of used symbolically to blame the British. The Blight wasn't their fault, but they didn't really do a lot to alleviate it. But in some ways, it was exaggerated to create like a political crystallization, and was used through the 20th century amongst Irish political organizations to resist colonialism and eventually in parts of Ireland depose British colonial rule too. So yes, kind of, but also that was the use of imagery and stories about it was largely to crystallize an Irish political movement. If you would like to read more about this, I would highly recommend, hopefully another book you can get out of the library, Hasha Diner's Hungering for America. Hungering for America looks at 3 different 19th century immigrant groups and talks about their foodways pre-immigration and post-immigration as well. Really, really incredible book. Again, that's Hasha Diner, Hungering for America.
All right, got it. Thank you. And then the other one was, there was a comment, the picture that you showed of 5 Points looks like North End today. North End is an area of Boston. And then someone asked where 5 Points was, and I think I found it on a map and sent that to them. So hopefully that cleared that up for them.
You might not have. 5 Points doesn't exist anymore. It was bulldozed in the late 19th century. It is under a park called Columbus Park in Lower Manhattan today. And that park is on the border of what is today Chinatown and also the government district. So like it's the Manhattan prison system and the court system overlooks it as well. But always a place worth visiting. It's, you know, in cities where people don't have a lot of indoor space, they live, their living rooms are outside. Let me put it that way. That's another reason that Irish bars were historically important. And that's a reason why public spaces like parks are important in cities today. So going to a place like Columbus Park, you will see people playing mahjong and poker, practicing instruments, doing Tai Chi, kids playing basketball, soccer. There's a playground there. There's bathrooms there. It's really, really an interesting place. So what was 5 Points is underneath that and now gone, now no longer exists. Someone also asked if I'd been to the Merchant's House Museum, and I haven't been in many years, but it really, really is fascinating. I have no idea what their education program is like nowadays, if it's tours or self-guided or whatever. I do know that since I've been there, they've restored the servants' quarters, which are on the 4th floor. So it really can give you a sense of what life was like in this time period. And the story is bananas. Like the same family lived there from the 1830s to the 1930s. And when the daughters died, like I think they had updated it to gas and that's it. You know, everything was still very much like the middle of the 19th century. So it's a really extraordinarily preserved property.
Gail said that after some research, we don't have any Irish bars older than 1854, but our oldest tavern dates to 1780. So we have.
That's fair. You do keep all the colonial history up there in Massachusetts. Next time you're in New York, get down to McSorley's. It's truly, truly worth it. It is like, there's so many little details about it that as a scholar of historical drinking, I can look at it and say, oh my gosh, this is just like a tavern from the 1850s. So you can go in and just like absorb the atmosphere and feel very Irish in there.
That was someone mentioned that the Today Show was at McSorley's this morning.
Oh, was it? Yeah, this is their day. This is the day you don't want to go to McSorley's. It's also basically on the NYU campus. So especially tonight, it's going to be packed full of college kids. My favorite time to go is at like 2 in the afternoon. You just sit there. They've got these booths by the window and the sun shines in. It's quiet. You talk to the bartender, who's usually Irish. It's wonderful.
Was lamb a prevalent meat in Ireland?
It was not. While Ireland is known for lamb and sheep and wool today, sheep is actually not not a lot of people raise sheep. They might have raised some for their landlords essentially, but no Irish people ate lamb. It's not common here. That's very much like a new part of Irish cuisine.
And you mentioned Irish soda bread, but what about scones and other kinds of pastries? Are those British? English?
British, yeah. I mean, even the sort of historical festive Christian holiday breads were all sort of like variation of like slightly sweet yeasted bread with raisins in it. And so the big shift was just like adding this American ingredient, this chemical leavener. I should say too, that a lot of the reason that there isn't as much as an Irish relationship with food as there is with other immigrant cultures is because Irish Catholicism is based a lot around fasting as opposed to feasting. So you don't have like the Feast of Seven Fishes like you do in Italian Catholicism. You've got this very, there's magic elements to Irish Catholicism, but in some ways it's like very reserved and very constricting. So it was a Catholic culture that was based around not eating as opposed to eating. Someone in the comments asked about brown bread. Brown bread, that's all you, Boston. That's you, baby. All your molasses and sugar producing in the 18th century. Like, I'd have to look and see what like the older ancestry of brown bread is. But as far as like bread in a can made from molasses, like that's super New England. Just put it in a pot, boil it. Molasses was literally running through the streets at some point. So like, that's very Irish American, I would say, and specifically Boston. Some of you will be shocked by this, but I first came across a recipe for like bread in a can 5 years ago. And I was like, what is this insanity? And of course it was my friends from Boston who were like, yeah, bread in a can. Love it. Delicious.
That's I haven't heard of that yet, but I'm sure.
Oh, you can at the grocery store. I bet there are people in the chat right now that can
probably
give you like brand names. You can definitely make it yourself, but you have to like, it's a little bit like old style puddings like dessert puddings, and that you'd sort of boil it in a can and a thing. But most Bostonians, I think, don't make their own. Anyone who lives in Massachusetts, you can find it in the grocery store.
There are a couple of mentions saying that they loved it.
Yes.
So that's all the questions that we have. We have lots of accolades, though, lots of thank yous, lots of wonderful talk. She's brilliant. So we'll definitely have you back.
Oh, that would be lovely. I know we're already talking about it too. Thank you for joining me on this St. Patrick's Day. I hope you all have a very merry one. Oh, someone mentioned oats too. Yeah, oats are a very like pre-colonial Irish food. And then they started coming back like in the early 20th century as Irish diet expanded again. But they're in some ways more traditionally like Scottish. It's like the sharing of that. Oh, people are saying you have to have me back.
Absolutely, we will. All right.
Thanks everyone. This was so much fun. Bye.
Thank you, Sarah. Good night.
Night.